On May 31st, 1889, at 3:10 in the afternoon, the South Fork Dam gave way. 20 million tons of water dropped through a 300-foot breach into the valley of the Little Conemaugh River. Not as a rising flood, as a mass, a moving wall of water and debris 35 to 40 feet tall in places, as wide as the valley floor, carrying inside it everything it had consumed in the 14 miles since the dam. Trees stripped bare of their bark, entire houses tumbling slowly in the current, locomotives ripped from their tracks, iron girders, railroad cars, the entire Gautier wireworks, and the people who had not reached high ground in time. It travelled at 40 miles an hour through the mountain valley's narrow upper reaches. It slowed as the valley widened below, but it was still moving at 20 miles per hour when it hit the city. The waves struck Johnstown at 4:07 in the afternoon. By 4:17 Johnstown was gone. 10 minutes, 2,209 confirmed dead, 99 entire families. Not one member surviving to give their names, 396 children under the age of 10. The youngest victim on record was 6 weeks old. Bodies were found 150 miles downstream. Some were never found at all. In the decades after the flood, farmers working their fields along the Conemaugh Valley would turn up bones in the soil. Some still do. Here is what made the Johnstown Flood different from every other American disaster of the 19th century. It was not an accident. The South Fork Dam had been deteriorating for 12 years. 4 separate engineers had inspected it and submitted written reports describing its structural failures in specific detail. The president of the largest company in the valley had written directly to the dam's owners demanding repairs in 1880. The warnings were sent, received, filed, and ignored. Because the men who owned that dam were not ordinary men. They were Carnegie, Frick, Mellon. 53 of the wealthiest industrialists in western Pennsylvania gathered in a private fishing and hunting club on a mountain lake 450 feet above a city of 30,000 people who, for the most part, did not know the lake existed. They had modified the dam for their recreational convenience. They had removed the safety mechanisms. They had screened the spillway to keep their stocked fish from escaping downstream. And when the dam failed and 2,209 people died, not one of them spent a single day in court. The court called it an act of God. We are going to count exactly what that act cost. Here is the thing about Johnstown. Most people hear that name and picture a small, vulnerable mill town tucked helplessly in the mountains. That is wrong. By 1889, Johnstown was an industrial powerhouse. The Cambria Iron Works, founded in 1852, was one of the largest steel producers in the United States. 11,000 workers on the payroll, rail lines running in every direction. Johnstown had produced the first commercially viable steel rails in America. The rails that carried Carnegie's empire, the rails that bound the continent after the Transcontinental Railroad was finished. Many of them came out of the furnaces of Johnstown. The city had doubled in population over 2 decades. 30,000 people packed into a narrow valley at the confluence of the Conemaugh River and Stony Creek, hemmed on every side by steep Allegheny ridges. That geography is the whole story. Not just of the flood, but of everything that preceded it. The valley was a funnel. 2 rivers met at the bottom. When they ran high, the water had nowhere to go but up the streets. There was no floodplain to absorb the overflow, no room to spread, just vertical stone ridges on every side and one narrow gorge leading out. Johnstown flooded every spring. The rivers rose, the water crept up into the lower neighborhoods. Furniture went to the second floor, and when the water receded, people cleaned the mud off their floors and went back to work. It was annoying. It was occasionally damaging. It was never catastrophic, never. And that is precisely what made the warnings about the dam easy to dismiss. When you have lived your whole life in a valley that floods every spring and survived every single time, the idea that this particular flood will be different requires a kind of imagination that experience actively works against. You put your furniture upstairs, you wait, you come back down. That is what Johnstown had always done. And that habitual confidence is as much a part of this story as the dam itself. The Little Conemaugh River runs into Johnstown from the east. Follow it 14 miles upstream into the Allegheny Highlands and you reach the village of South Fork, a few hundred people on a hillside above the river. Above South Fork, the valley narrows before opening briefly into a mountain cove, and in that cove, held back by an earthen dam across the valley mouth, sat the largest artificial reservoir in the United States. Lake Conemaugh, almost 2 miles long, nearly a mile wide, holding at full capacity 20 million tons of water, 450 feet above the valley floor, 14 miles upstream from 30,000 people. The South Fork Dam had not always been a danger. When it was built, it was a legitimate feat of American civil engineering. Construction began in 1838 under the Pennsylvania Board of Canal Commissioners. The state canal system needed a reservoir to feed water into the Western Division Canal, the waterway carrying goods over the Allegheny Mountains before railroads made canals obsolete. The dam was an earthfill structure, standard engineering for the era, not concrete, not masonry. Compacted earth and clay and broken stone, built 931 feet long at the crest, 72 feet tall, 272 feet wide at the base. Earthfill dams, when designed correctly, work on physics that favour them. The base is wider than the top. The fill compacts under its own weight. The structure distributes load horizontally across a broad foundation. And critically, the dam had the single most important safety feature of any water retention structure: discharge pipes. Two 24-inch cast iron pipes buried through the base of the dam, with sluice valves that could be opened to release water at a controlled rate. If the reservoir climbed too high, if spring snowmelt or heavy rains pushed the lake toward the crest, the operator opened the valves and lowered the lake level before the water reached the danger threshold. That was the mechanism. That was the margin between a working dam and a catastrophic failure waiting to happen. The dam took 15 years to build. It was completed in 1853. By 1857, the Pennsylvania Railroad had made the canal system worthless, and the state was selling off its infrastructure piece by piece. The South Fork Dam, the reservoir, the entire property, sold to the Pennsylvania Railroad for $3,500. The railroad had no use for a dam. They wanted the right-of-way through the valley and nothing else, so they let the reservoir drain. And they removed the discharge pipes, pulled them out of the base of the dam and sold them for scrap iron, a few $100s for the cast iron. That decision, removing those pipes, made everything that followed possible. Without the discharge pipes, the only outlet for the reservoir in a flood was the spillway, a channel cut into the hillside beside the dam to route overflow around the structure. And if the spillway became inadequate or obstructed, there was nothing left. There was only the dam and the water, and the question of which was stronger. In 1862, a spring flood partially breached the dam and drained part of the reservoir. Repairs were made, rough field expedient repairs, not engineered ones, and the breach was patched with whatever was available. The property changed hands twice more before 1879, each time at a loss. By the time the next buyers arrived, the discharge pipes had been gone for 2 decades, the spillway had partially silted, and the patch from 1862 had never been properly re-engineered. The asking price was $2,500, less than the railroad had paid. The buyers were not engineers, they were sportsmen. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club incorporated in 1879. Its membership reads like a roster of the Gilded Age's highest tier. Andrew Carnegie, whose steel and railroad holdings would make him the richest man in the world. Henry Clay Frick, who ran Carnegie's coke and steel operations with a reputation for absolute ruthlessness toward labor. Andrew Mellon, the banker and financier whose descendants would fund some of America's most prominent cultural institutions. Philander Knox, who would become Attorney General of the United States under President McKinley. Robert Pitcairn, superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Pittsburgh Division. 53 members in total, $800 a year in dues. A private lake in the mountains stocked with black bass and perch brought up from Lake Erie for recreational fishing. They built a clubhouse with wide porches overlooking the water, 16 summer cottages along the lake shore, a boathouse, a stable, a private spur off the main rail line so members could arrive from Pittsburgh in their personal railroad cars without needing to stop in the town below. The lakeside retreated from the industrial smoke of Pittsburgh, accessible only to those who could afford admission, hidden in the Allegheny Mountains. It was, by any measure, among the most exclusive private retreats in America, and it was held in place by a dam that had been deteriorating for 20 years when they bought it. When the club took possession, the dam needed serious structural attention. The breach from 1862 had been patched poorly. The spillway was undersized relative to the reservoir's capacity. The structure had not had a proper engineering inspection in years. The club hired a local contractor to make repairs. The contractor used fill, brush, mud and site debris, not engineered material, not compacted clay, laid in engineered lifts according to proper earth-fill dam construction methods. He used what was cheap and fast. Then the club made 3 modifications to the dam that compounded the structural problems significantly. First, they stretched wire mesh screens across the opening of the spillway to prevent their expensive stocked fish from escaping into the river downstream. The screens caught floating debris, leaves, branches, sediment, especially during high water events, exactly when maximum spillway drainage was most critical. When clogged, the screens cut the spillway's effective drainage capacity by more than half. Nobody maintained the screens during floods. Nobody had standing orders to clear them when the water rose. They sat in the spillway opening and collected debris like a drain cover in a storm. Second, the club lowered the center of the dam's crest by approximately 2 feet to allow carriages to cross more easily from one side of the lake to the other. 2 feet off a 72-foot dam sounds trivial. It is not trivial. That 2 feet represented the difference between 1 million tons of water staying in the reservoir and finding the lowest point on the dam crest and beginning to flow over it. Engineers have a term for the vertical distance between a reservoir's water surface and the top of the dam: freeboard. Freeboard is the margin of safety. The club reduced their safety margin by roughly 1 million tons of water capacity, so that members could cross the dam by carriage. Third, nothing was done about the discharge pipes. They had been removed before the club purchased the property. No contractor was hired to reinstall them. No bid was sought. No one appears to have seriously considered it. The club owned the dam for 10 years. In 10 years, the discharge pipes were never replaced. Engineers noticed 4 of them. John Fulton, a prominent civil engineer from Johnstown, inspected the dam in 1880 at the request of Daniel Morrell, president of Cambria Iron. Fulton's report was specific and unambiguous. The discharge pipes had been removed and not replaced. The spillway was obstructed. The crest had been lowered. The patching from the 1862 breach was structurally inadequate. If the dam failed, Fulton wrote, the consequences for the valley below would be beyond computation. He submitted the report. Morrell sent his own letter directly to the club, naming the structural deficiencies explicitly and requesting immediate repairs. The club's president responded with a polite letter, acknowledging receipt. Nothing changed. A second inspection produced the same findings, the same politely deflective response, a third warning, a fourth. Spring after spring, engineers looked at the South Fork Dam and wrote the same report, and spring after spring, the club's members arrived from Pittsburgh on their private rail cars, fished the lake they had stocked with Erie perch, held dinners on the clubhouse porch, and watched the water level rise without visible concern. The warnings accumulated in filing cabinets. The dam continued to deteriorate. The lake continued to fill. May 30th, 1889. Memorial Day. Johnstown turned out for parades and picnics. The weather had been wet for weeks. The whole region had been soaking since early May, but the holiday was the holiday. Church in the morning, park in the afternoon. At the lake, 61 club members and their families were in residence for the early start of the summer season. The water was already high. Spring snowmelt and 6 weeks of rain had pushed Lake Conemaugh to within 2 feet of the dam crest. John Park, 23 years old, a recent civil engineering graduate from the University of Pennsylvania, the only trained engineer on site, had noted the lake level with concern for days. He had no mechanism to reduce it. There were no discharge pipes. The clogged spillway screens were running at partial capacity. The lake sat 2 feet below the crest and waited. The storm system that had been building over the Gulf of Mexico all week stalled over the Allegheny Mountains on the night of May 30th. It dropped between 6 and 10 inches of rain in less than 24 hours on mountains that were already holding as much water as the soil would absorb. Runoff that normally would have taken days to reach the river system arrived in hours. Every tributary of the Conemaugh was in full flood before midnight. By 3 in the morning on May 31st, the Conemaugh was over its banks in Johnstown. By 6 a.m., streets in the lower neighbourhoods were under 4 feet of water. People did what they always did, moved furniture upstairs, grumbled, went to work. By 6 a.m. at the dam, Park understood that this was not an ordinary spring flood. The lake was rising at 10 inches an hour. The spillway was overwhelmed. The screens were packed with debris carried in by the runoff and could not be cleared fast enough. At the current rate, the water would reach the dam crest in less than 4 hours. Park sent a rider immediately to South Fork to telegraph a warning downstream. Then he organised every available man, workers, club staff, stable hands, anyone on the property, and started trying to cut a second emergency spillway channel through the hillside by hand. He used 20 men with shovels trying to divert a lake that held 20 million tons. Do the math. The lake was rising 10 inches an hour. 20 men with shovels in clay and rock would need days to cut a channel of sufficient depth and width to matter. They had hours at most. They kept shoveling anyway. By 9 a.m., the first telegraph warning had been forwarded downstream. At the Johnstown Telegraph office, the message was received by Emma Ehrenfeld, one of the few female operators in the region, who forwarded it further downstream and posted notice in the city. The message said the dam was liable to break. Prepare the people of Johnstown. Johnstown had heard versions of this message before. Every spring someone said the dam was dangerous. Every spring the dam held. The furniture was already upstairs. What was there to do? By 11 a.m. the water reached the dam crest. At 11:30 Park watched it begin to wash over the centre section, the lowest point where the crest had been reduced for carriage access. Not through the spillway, over the dam itself. When water flows over the crest of an earth-filled dam, it begins to erode the downstream face. The water the dam is retaining starts to eat the dam from the outside. The process accelerates as it deepens. More water flows, the breach widens. The widening breach allows more water, which widens the breach faster. There is no intervention at this stage. There is no patching a breach in an earth-filled dam while a lake is pouring through it. There is only watching it happen and making decisions about what to do next. Parker had his men work until 2:30 p.m. A 300-foot section of the crest was failing. The breach was widening faster than any shovel could address. By 3 p.m., the dam's entire centre section was in collapse. By 3:10, the dam was gone. Not partially breached, not leaking. Gone. The lake did not drain. It did not flow. It fell. 20 million tons of water dropped through a 300-foot gap in less than 45 minutes. What formed at the base of that gap and began moving down the valley was not a river in flood. It was a mass, a rolling hill of water, and everything the water had already consumed. Trees stripped bare, barns, the village of South Fork itself, 2 railroad bridges, an iron viaduct, an entire hillside of timber. The mass moved at 40 miles an hour through the narrow upper valley. At Woodvale, the borough immediately above Johnstown, the wave was 35 to 40 feet tall and 500 yards wide, moving through a valley barely wider than the wave itself. Woodvale had 1,000 residents. The wave took 314 of them. It consumed the Gautier Wire Works, a major steel facility, multiple buildings, hundreds of tons of machinery, and distributed it downstream in pieces. It took Woodvale streets, its houses, its church, and left behind nothing recognizable in under a minute. Think about what that means. A community of 1,000 people. Gone in under a minute. The wave hit Johnstown at 4:07 p.m. Victor Heiser was 16 years old. His parents owned a livery stable near the confluence of the rivers. He was on the upper floor when he looked out and saw it coming. He said later it did not look like water. It looked like a dark hill of moving things rolling toward him. He ran to the roof. He watched his parents taken. He jumped from one rooftop to the next as each one went under, crossing the debris field in motion, running across the surface of a moving city. He survived. He wrote about it for the rest of his life. He described the sound not as a roar, not as the wall of noise people imagine, but as a shrieking whistle. The air compressed ahead of the mass, screaming through gaps in the debris before the debris itself arrived. And then it arrived. The Hubert House Hotel, 4 stories, demolished. The Union Street School, gone. St. John's Church, gone. The Alma Hall, a new building recently completed, a source of civic pride, torn from its foundation and carried downstream. 1,600 acres of city under 30 feet of mud and debris in 10 minutes. Then the silence. The particular silence that follows when everything that was in motion stops. The wave pushed the debris of Johnstown downstream until it hit the Pennsylvania Railroad stone bridge at the lower end of the valley. The stone bridge did not move. Built in 1887, multiple arch spans of dressed masonry, it was the most substantial structure remaining in the valley. The wave could not take it. The debris packed against its arches, houses, trees, railroad cars, iron beams, furniture, telegraph poles, bodies. Within an hour, 30 acres of wreckage were packed against the bridge, 40 feet deep in places. And trapped in that pile were hundreds of survivors, people who had ridden the wave on pieces of houses, who had grabbed hold of trees and held on, who had survived 20 million tons of water only to find themselves embedded in a debris field at the bridge, unable to move, unable to free themselves. At approximately 6 p.m. the debris pile caught fire. The ignition source is unknown, probably oil from a derailed railroad tank car, or a toppled stove, or a lamp. Whatever it was, the pile was built to burn. 30 acres of dry timber and structural wood soaked in oil, compressed into a mass 40 feet tall, fed by open air. It was impossible to extinguish. It burned for 3 days. An estimated 80 people who had survived the wave died in the fire at the stone bridge. They had lived through 20 million tons of moving water. They died in the debris it left behind. By the morning of June 1st, the valley was unrecognizable. Johnstown, the Johnstown of steel rails and immigrant neighborhoods and civic pride, had been replaced by a mudfield. The debris left by the wave covered 1,600 acres to depths of 20 feet or more in places. Bodies were in trees, under debris, buried in the silt. In the lower portions of the valley, the mud was so deep that entire structures had been swallowed. The search and recovery effort in the first hours was conducted by survivors in shock, by volunteers from surrounding communities, by anyone who could reach the valley. There was no plan. Nothing in 1889 had prepared anyone for a disaster of this scale and speed in a single location. The official death count settled at 2,209. That number is almost certainly low. 99 entire families were wiped out without a single surviving member to report them missing. The missing persons list submitted by survivors kept changing in the first weeks as it became clear that entire households had simply ceased to exist. Clara Barton and the American Red Cross arrived on June 5th. It was the organization's first major domestic disaster deployment. They stayed for 5 months. Barton built temporary hotels, not tents, actual hotels, to house survivors who had lost everything. The Red Cross managed food lines, medical care, clothing distribution, and rebuilding assistance on a scale no American relief organization had attempted before. Relief poured in from around the world: the United States, London, Berlin, Tokyo, $3,700,000 in donations. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club sent nothing of substance. Individual members made token donations. Carnegie gave $10,000. a sum he could have produced without consulting his accounts. The club as an institution issued no acknowledgement of responsibility, established no fund for survivors, made no public statement connecting its dam to 2,209 deaths. The clean-up took years. Buried in the mud were thousands of personal effects, the physical record of 30,000 lives, and an unknown number of bodies that were never recovered. The identification work continued for months. A temporary morgue on Main Street processed over 1,000 bodies in its first 2 weeks of operation. Volunteers worked around the clock matching the dead to the missing persons list submitted daily. Many bodies were never identified, many were never found, some families never learned what happened to their relatives. The absence of remains, the absence of records left grief without resolution for hundreds of Johnstown families. Here is what happened legally. In the months following the flood, survivors and the families of the dead brought civil suits against the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Over 20 lawsuits were filed. They argued negligence, reckless disregard of documented engineering deficiencies, the removed discharge pipes, the obstructed spillway, the lowered crest, the 4 engineering reports, Morell's letter, 11 years of ignored warnings. The facts were not disputed. The dam had failed. The deficiencies had been documented. The documentation had been ignored. The club's attorneys responded with a single argument. The flood was an act of God, an extraordinary rainfall of unprecedented intensity, an event no one could have foreseen or prevented, a natural disaster, not a man-made one. Every lawsuit was dismissed, every single one. The courts accepted the act of God defense in full. No club member was charged with a crime. No member was convicted of negligence. Not one faced any legal penalty of any kind for the death of 2,209 people. The doctrine that protected them already existed in American common law, the principle that an unforeseeable natural event could break the chain of causation between an actor's negligence and the resulting harm. If the storm was unforeseeable, then the dam's deficiencies were legally irrelevant. The storm would have overtopped any dam. The failure was nature's doing. This argument ignored the lowered crest that reduced the freeboard by 2 feet. It ignored the removed discharge pipes that would have allowed the lake level to be drawn down in the days before the storm arrived. It ignored the spillway screens that had cut drainage capacity precisely when drainage mattered most. It ignored 4 written engineering reports stating in plain language that the dam posed a catastrophic risk to the valley below. The act of God defense succeeded regardless, because the club's attorneys were among the best connected in Pennsylvania, because the club's members had relationships with the judiciary and the political establishment that the dead of Johnstown did not have, and because the legal infrastructure of American liability had not yet developed the capacity to hold wealthy private actors accountable for the condition of infrastructure they owned above inhabited areas. The ruling became a legal landmark, one of the earliest American precedents defining the limits of negligence liability for privately owned dams. It was cited for decades afterward. Carnegie built Carnegie Hall in New York in 1891. He eventually gave away the majority of his fortune to libraries, universities, and cultural institutions before his death in 1919. He is remembered as one of the great American philanthropists. Frick survived an assassination attempt in 1892 during the Homestead Strike, a strike he helped provoke by cutting wages and bringing in Pinkerton agents, and died in 1919, leaving one of the finest private art collections in the world, now open to the public as the Frick Collection on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. Mellon became Secretary of the Treasury under 3 presidents. Knox became Attorney General. Pitcairn retired quietly. None of them ever addressed Johnstown publicly again after 1889. None of them were required to. Johnstown rebuilt. The valley was cleaned, the streets relaid, the buildings reconstructed. Cambria Iron reopened within months. The workers came back. The city came back. It flooded again in 1936, the St. Patrick's Day flood, water rising to the rooflines in the lower wards for the second time in living memory. and again in 1977, when remnants of Hurricane Agnes dumped 7 inches of rain in a few hours and killed 84 people. The valley is still a valley. The rivers still meet at the bottom. The geography has not changed. Here is what remains from May 31st, 1889. The stone bridge is still standing, the same arch spans that stopped the debris pile against which the fire burned for 3 days still carry traffic over the Conemaugh River. You can walk out onto it today. The abutments are original. If you look at the right angle in the right light, you can still see faint waterline marks on the stonework, the high water mark of a wave that passed through 135 years ago. The South Fork Dam site is now the Johnstown Flood National Memorial, administered by the National Park Service. You can drive to it, walk the trail around the former lake bed. The lake never refilled. After the dam failed, the valley drained permanently and the land was reclaimed by forest over the following decades. What you see now is a broad, quiet bowl in the mountains, forested floor, steep wooded sides, birdsong. At one end, 2 earthen abutments standing on either side of the valley, the original dam shoulders still there after 135 years of weather and tree growth and forgetting. Between them, a low depression. That is the gap. That is where 20 million tons of water left. The former club site is gone. The clubhouse burned in 1903. The cottages deteriorated and were demolished. The boathouse is gone. The fish have been dead for more than a century. There are no plaques at the dam site that name the club's members. The park interprets the engineering, the geology, the flood sequence, the legal aftermath. The names that belong on a wall at the Johnstown Flood National Memorial, Carnegie, Frick, Mellon, Knox, Pitcairn, are not on a wall there. They are on buildings in Pittsburgh and New York and Washington, on the Art Museum, on the university, on the concert hall, in the reading rooms of the libraries he built for cities across America. Andrew Carnegie's name is carved in stone above the door. In Johnstown, the stone bridge is still standing, and in the quiet forest above the valley, the gap between 2 earthen abutments is what it is, an absence. The shape left behind when something that should not have been there finally gave way. The thing about the Johnstown flood that disappears in the retelling is time, not the 10 minutes it took the wave to destroy the city. The 11 years before that. 11 years of engineers writing reports, of letters from the president of Cambria Iron requesting repairs, of local officials looking up at a mountain lake and doing the math, of residents in Johnstown passing the telegraph office every spring and hearing the same warning and putting their furniture upstairs and going back to work, because what was the alternative? What do you do when the men who own the danger above you have also purchased the legal and political system that might compel them to fix it? You put your furniture upstairs, you wait, you come back down. The dam was not a natural feature. It was a structure built by human hands, modified by human decisions, maintained or not maintained by human choices year after year, while the warnings accumulated in filing cabinets and the lake sat full above the valley. When it failed because of specific decisions made by specific people. The discharge pipes were not removed by weather. The spillway screens were not installed by nature. The crest was not lowered by God. Men did those things, men with names and addresses and railroad cars and private lake cottages, men who were never asked in a court of law under oath to explain what they had done and why and what they had known. The act of God ruling protected a fiction, that 20 million tons of water above a city of 30,000 people is a natural condition, and that the decisions to hold it there without safety mechanisms and to ignore the engineers who said it would kill people, and to obstruct the only drainage pathway for a lake of that size, that all of that was merely the backdrop to a natural event. Nature did the killing. The men did nothing. We know their names: Carnegie, Frick, Mellon, Knox, Pitcairn. Their names are on institutions that have outlasted everyone who died at Johnstown by more than a century. Buildings with reading rooms and marble floors and entrance fees that the workers of Cambria Iron could never have afforded, built with money those men kept because the law decided in 1889 that some acts of men are easier to call acts of God. We don't know the names of the 396 children under 10. We don't know the names the mud kept. We know the youngest victim was 6 weeks old. We know 99 families were erased entirely. We know the farmers still find bones along the valley downstream. The stone bridge is still standing. The gap in the dam is still there. Go stand between those two earthen abutments on a quiet afternoon and look down the valley. It is very quiet up there, very still. Think about what left through that gap. Think about who built the thing that held it. Think about who paid when it failed. The answer to the last question is not the men with the fish screens. It is never the men with the fish screens. That is the oldest rule of the machine, and the Johnstown Flood is what it looks like when the machine works exactly as intended and the water finally runs out of somewhere to go.